this evening. So I thought I would just like start by bringing us all up to speed on what the book is about. So like, what's the kind of core argument of this book, We Have Never Been Woke?
So the we in We Have Never Been Woke is this constellation of elites that I call symbolic capitalists. I call them symbolic capitalists because we make a living mostly on kind of what we know, who we know, and how we're known. That is by kind of cultivating and leveraging what this other sociologist called symbolic capital on behalf of ourselves and other people. So a less nerdy way of understanding who symbolic capitalists are to think about people who work in fields like journalism, HR, academia, consulting, finance, law, science and technology, and so on. People who make a living by manipulating goods and, by manipulating ideas and rhetoric and data and things like this instead of providing physical goods and services to people. Okay, so what's interesting about symbolic capitalists? Well, there's a bunch of things that are interesting about them, but one thing that's interesting about symbolic capitalists is that from the beginning of a lot of our professions, we've defined ourselves in terms of altruism and serving the common good. So to use my own professions, journalists are supposed to speak truth to power, to be a voice for the voiceless, to educate citizens, to be good participants in democracy. And academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to tell the truth without regards to anyone's political or economic interests. These kinds of altruistic aspirations define the professions from the beginning. And if you look today, contemporary symbolic capitalists are overwhelmingly aligned with the Democratic Party. We overwhelmingly self-identify as liberal. We're the Americans who are most likely to self-identify as anti-racist, as feminists, as allies to LGBTQ people, as environmentalists, and so on. And so what you might expect, given this deep commitment to egalitarianism, given the ways that we define ourselves and so on, is that as people like us gained more power and status in society, you might expect to see inequality shrinking, longstanding social problems getting fixed, growing trust in institutions because of all the great work that we're doing. And what I show in the book is that over the last 50 years, there have been these important changes to the global economy that have led to symbolic capitalists having a lot more power and influence than ever before. But the consequences of that shift have been very far from what we might expect. Instead, we see over the last 50 years, as we've gained in power and influence, we've been seeing growing inequalities, growing affective polarization, increasing institutional dysfunction, increasing mistrust of institutions. And so kind of the core puzzle the book is trying to wrestle with is like, what's going on here? Why is that? Why do we see the world we actually live in instead of the world that we might have hoped or expected, the world that, in fact, earlier generations of symbolic capitalists promised, that if people like us were given more power and influence, that we'd see all of these good things. They haven't really materialized, even though we have gotten more power and influence. So that's kind of the core question, the core puzzle the book is wrestling with.
So let me push you a little bit on this, because, two things happen together. It doesn't mean one explains the other, right? So you basically have told me that, there's a bunch of people, symbolic capitalists, who are getting more powerful, and that as they've gotten more powerful, inequality has increased. But I would say, well, a different counterfactual would be if other people had been in power, maybe inequality would have increased a lot faster, or maybe there would have been a lot more inequality. So I'm curious, like, what are the things that symbolic capitalists are doing that you think are driving this inequality?
Yeah. So there's a few things that I think are important to context for understanding some of these trends. One of them is that increasingly institutions of knowledge production, like colleges and universities, serve this important role in shaping like whose perspectives are worth taking seriously, are worth engaging with, which perspectives are worth, and the fact that the distribution of these credentials across society is not evenly distributed, but in fact kind of tracks along the lines of class, geography, race, and so on, is part of the reason why, even though there's less overt discrimination along the lines of race and gender and so on today, we actually haven't seen a lot of progress in terms of racialized inequality is because we're no longer overtly discriminating against people on race. We're discriminating on people based on credentials, but credentials are also track along the lines of a lot of these racialized inequalities. And so part of it, and actually, okay, I don't want to go on a tangent, but I'll go on a brief tangent.
Yeah.
So, because there's this essay that haunts me. It haunts me, like I think about it all the time. It's by this guy, Bertrand Cooper. It's called Who Gets to Create Black Culture? And what Cooper argues in this article is that if George Floyd, after George Floyd was murdered, there were all these specials about him on HBO, on CNN, on everywhere, and unending articles about George Floyd and his life. Nancy Pelosi took a knee with the kente cloth, and all these, Chuck Schumer. And so what Cooper asks is, imagine a world in which George Floyd hadn't been killed. Imagine a world in which he just lived his life that day, didn't encounter the police, but he wanted to write for the New York Times or the Atlantic or any of these other people that care about him so much and talk about him incessantly. Would he be able to write for these outlets? And the answer, of course, is no, because George Floyd doesn't have a college degree, and people in the NPR, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and all these other outlets, frankly, don't really care what people like George Floyd think or feel about anything. Their perspectives are completely absent from all of these outlets. And in fact, when we're sometimes forced to confront the inconvenient views of people like George Floyd, we sometimes shoot the messenger who delivered us the kind of inconvenient views of someone like George Floyd. And so there's something perverse about the fact that, we started caring about George Floyd because he was killed in public and became a symbol that we could manipulate in our struggles over power and status. That's when we started caring about George Floyd. But a world in which that didn't happen, we wouldn't have known George Floyd from Adam, cared about him one whit, the perspectives of people like him absent. And so this is one of these aspects in which college degrees and these credentials from these knowledge economy institutions, especially from elite institutions like Princeton and Columbia, play this important role in kind of shaping who matters in society. And so this is one of the ways in which we've seen, it's not just incidental that we have these knowledge economy professionals and we have inequality, but literally the way that we structure these institutions and use these institutions to allocate resources and prestige and things like this to mark people as being worthy of elite lives or even middle class lives or not, is one of the core drivers of a lot of contemporary inequalities.